In this video, we're going to talk about finding the slope of a line, and in particular, for this example, we're going to find the slope of a line from a graph. So the first thing that we want to remember is, what exactly are we talking about when we're talking about slope? And when we're talking about slope, we want to remember that a slope is the rate of change between two variables. So as one variable is changing, how is it impacting the other variable? And we think of this most commonly in one common thing in today's terms would be miles per gallon, or miles per hour might be an even better example. As time goes on, as we're driving a longer and longer amount of time, how many miles are we traveling in that amount of time? And if we're traveling at a consistent speed, there's a constant rate of change. There's a constant increase in the number of miles for every particular number of hours that we're driving. In this case, we just have a general graph with no kinds of units. So we're just looking at basically the change in x over the change in y. How is y changing as x changes? Now there's this little symbol that you may or may not have seen called delta. If you haven't seen it yet, I'm sure you will at some point. Delta just means the change in. Okay, it's sort of shorthand symbol for that. So when we're talking about slope of this line, we want to talk about the change in y over the change in x. As y changes, how much does x change for the amount that y changes? Now the other formula that you'll see this equal to is y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. And what that just means again is for any change in y, when y changes from one value to another, how does the same x value change in that time? Now if we're going to be measuring change from a graph that we can actually see, what we're looking at is, literally, if this is our point number 2 here, okay, up here we'll say this is our point x2, y2, and down here is our point x1, y1. We literally want to know, what is this change here? How much did this graph move? How much did these points move in this amount of change? So just looking at this from a graph, we can actually just count. We don't have to do a formula or anything else, because what we're looking at is the change in y. How much does y change compared to how much does x change? Well, y is this vertical direction, so we know that y has gone up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So as we go from this point here up to the second point, we know that y has gone up 7. Okay, so our change in y is a positive 7 because it has gone up 7 points. Now we want to know what happens as we move from this point to this point. What happens to its x value? Well, we can count again, but this time we have to say, well, this time we're going to the left, and on the x-axis to the left is negative. So we're moving to the left 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 spaces. So we're moving 5 spaces, but we're moving in the negative direction on the x-axis. So we have to make sure to take that into consideration. In the y-axis, it was positive because we went up. The x-axis, the x change is negative because we moved in the left direction. And so because we don't like negatives in the denominator, we would say that our slope in this case is negative 7/5. Okay? Now for this problem, it would be sufficient to just be able to do it this way for counting. But let's just kind of review how we would do it if all we knew were those points. So if we know that our point x1 is right here, we want to look at what the values of that point is. Well, the x value of that point is 5. and the y value for this point is -4. Okay, so that's our x1, y1. And now let's look at this point here. The x value of this point is 0, and the y value of this point is 3. Okay, so this is our x1, y1, x2, y2. Now if we wanted to use the formula to solve this problem instead of just counting, we would now plug it in. As y changes, as y goes from 3 to -4, so 3 minus -4, what happens to x? Well, x goes from 0 to 5. I apologize that these numbers keep disappearing. So y went from 3 to -4, and x went from 0 to 5. Okay? Now you'll notice this minus here is part of the equation, the formula. Notice up here we had a minus in the formula, as opposed to this sign here, this negative symbol here, that was part of the value of y was a -4. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're going through here if you're wondering why there are two negatives there. And now we just do the math. 3 minus -4 is the same as 3 plus 4, which is 7. 0 minus 5 is -5, and we end up with the same answer of -7/5. And that is the amount of change. So every time that y goes down by 7 values, x will go up by 5. And you could also think of it, this way where we had the negative here. Every time y goes up 7, x goes down 5. So that's how we would find the slope of a line on a graph, either by counting or by finding out what the points are and using the slope formula.